The Voice of Death. Once upon a time there lived a man whose one wish and prayer was to get rich. Day and night he thought of nothing else, and at last his prayers were granted, and he became very wealthy. Now, being rich and having so much to lose, he felt that it would be a terrible thing to die and to leave all his possessions behind. So he made up his mind to set out in search of a land where there was no death. He got ready for his journey and took leave of his wife and started. Whenever he came to a new country, the first question that he asked was whether people died in that land, and when he heard that they did, he set out again on his quest. At last he reached a country where he was told that the people did not even know the meaning of the word death. Our traveler was delighted when he heard this and said, "But surely there are great numbers of people in your land if no one ever dies." "No," they replied, "there are not great numbers, for you see from time to time a voice is heard calling, first one and then another, and whoever hears the voice gets up and goes away, and never comes back." "And do they see the person who calls him," he asked, "or do they only hear his voice?" "They both see and hear him," was the answer. Well, the man was amazed when he heard that the people were so stupid, and stupid enough to follow a voice, though they knew that if they went when it called, they themselves would never return. And he went back to his own home and got all of his possessions together, and taking his wife and family, he set out resolved to go and live in that country where the people did not die, but where instead they heard a voice calling them, which they followed into the land from which they never returned. For when he had made up his own mind that when he and any of his family heard the voice, they would pay it no heed, however loudly it seemed to call. After he had settled down in his new home and had got everything in order about him, he warned his wife and family that, unless they want to die, they must on no account listen to a voice which they might someday hear calling them. For some years, everything went well with them, and they lived happily in their new home. But one day, while they were getting together and sitting down for dinner, his wife suddenly started up, exclaiming in a loud voice, "I'm coming! I'm coming!" And she began to look around the room for her fur coat. But her husband jumped up, and taking her firm hold by the hand, held her fast and reproached her, saying, "Don't you remember what I told you? Stay where you are unless you wish to die." "But don't you hear that voice calling me?" she answered. "I am merely going to see why I am wanted. I shall be back directly." So she fought and struggled to get away from her husband, and to go where the voice summoned. But he would not let her go, and had all the doors of the house shut and bolted. When she saw that he had done this, she said, "Very well, dear husband, I shall do what you wish, and remain where I am." So her husband believed that it was all right, and that she had thought better of it, and had got over her mad impulse to obey the voice. But a few minutes later she made a sudden dash for one of the doors, opened it, and darted out, followed by her husband. He caught her by the fur coat, and begged and implored her not to go, for if she did, she would certainly never return. She said nothing, but let her arms fall backwards, and suddenly bending herself forward, slipped out of her coat, leaving it in her husband's hands. He, poor man, seemed turned to stone as he gazed after her hurrying away from him and calling at the top of her voice as she ran, "I am coming! I am coming!" When she was quite out of sight, her husband recovered his wits and went back into the house, murmuring, "If she is so foolish as to wish to die, I can't help it. I warned and implored her to pay no heed to that voice, however loudly it might call." Well, days and weeks and months and even years passed, and nothing happened to disturb the peace of the household. But one day the man was at the barber's as usual, getting his morning shave. The shop was full of people, and his chin had just been covered with the lather of soap, when suddenly, starting up from the chair, he called out in a loud voice, "I won't come, do you hear? I won't come!" The barber and the other people in the shop listened to him with amazement, but again, looking towards the door, he exclaimed, "I tell you, once and for all, I do not mean to come, so go away." And a few moments later, he called out again, "Go away, I'll tell you, or it will be the worse for you. You may as well call as much as you like, but you will never get me to come." He got so angry that you thought that someone was actually standing at the door tormenting him. At last he jumped up and caught the razor out of the barber's hands, exclaiming, "Give me that razor, and I'll teach him to let people alone for the future." And he rushed out of the shop as if he were running after someone whom no one else saw. The barber, determined not to lose his razor, pursued the man, and they both continued running at full speed until they had got well outside of town, when all of a sudden the man fell head foremost down a precipice, and was never seen again. So he too, like the others, had been forced against his will to follow the voice that called him. The barber, who went back to his shop whistling and congratulating himself on the escape that he had made, described what had happened, and it was noised about all across the country that the people who had gone away and had never returned had all fallen into that pit, for till then they had never known what happened to those who had heard the voice and obeyed its call. But when crowds of people went from the town to examine the ill-fated pit that swallowed up such numbers, they never, and yet never, seemed to be full. They could discover nothing. All that they could see was a vast plain that looked as if it had been there since the beginning of the world. And from that time the people of the country began to die like ordinary mortals, all the world over.